I will ask Mike Tessler and Scott Wharton to join us on the stage.
Ooh. So Mike, why don't we start off with, why don't you describe what you did before BroadSoft? You've been doing it 14 years. What happened in the pre-BroadSoft era?
Well, it's a long time ago. Before BroadSoft, I worked at a number of telecommunications manufacturers, predominantly a long stint at Nortel in the kind of building, in the good old days of Class 5 switching, intelligent network applications, applications directed at both the carrier market here in the U.S. and international. And then joined a wireless startup for a couple of years that was acquired. And then, as that unfolded through an acquisition, both our CTO at that startup, Scott Hoffbauer, and myself, decided it was time to branch out on our own and basically start BroadSoft. So that's kind of a little background of where we came from.
Great. And Scott is still with you today. So what was the inspiration for you guys starting the company?
So, back then, when we started to look at the industry, it was kind of early days of voice over IP, and there was a lot of companies that were focused in the transport, minutes delivery using the voice over IP technology to really kind of lower the cost of transit minutes around the world. Lots of hardware focus, lots of gateways, transforming from circuit switch to IP. And both Scott, who had also spent a long time at Nortel on the wireless side, and myself knew that eventually the industry was going to move from the transport and minutes layer to the application layer. And there was really nobody at that time, we felt, focusing on the application side. And so we felt, instead of copying all the companies that had kind of had been focused on the gateway, ports, hardware side, we decided to kind of branch out on the software side and on the application side. So we Scott swore to me that we couldn't build hardware, so we had to call the name. We had to go BroadSoft so that we could never ever do hardware. It's kind of a rule. Scott shuns hardware. So that's certainly proven to be a really good model to stay away from the hardware world. So we've definitely followed that.
Definitely. So a lot of companies, when they start off and change, they may have the same vision, but they change direction, do something differently. How has BroadSoft changed or strayed from the initial vision of applications over the years?
I think we're fortunate in a sense that we always saw ourselves as building these next generation applications on this enabling IP network, and saw that the IP network was going to flatten the world and things were going to change. But exactly which applications and which segments changed. We started a little bit more consumer-oriented, consumer-focused. You remember when you joined, that was a large debate. Do we stay the course on consumer, or do we move to a much more of a unified communications, is the word we use today. Definitely not the word we used 14 years ago. So I think we continuously kind of tuned the segments, the applications, but always imagine ourselves as being in the application layer. And I've tried kind of religiously to stay what we call kind of infrastructure agnostic, really focused on the application, and focused predominantly. One of the things that drives us is to really stay focused on the end user, kind of thinking about our service provider customers and their end users, and what would work well for those end users, and kind of staying in that side of, we always say we're kind of infrastructure to the end user side, and we certainly add more and more things every year, but really staying in that direction. So fortunately, a lot of startups have to make some pretty big changes. I think we've always kind of had that kind of consistent end user focus, which has kind of been very, very successful for us.
So one of the challenges, remember, in the early days, as you said, there was no applications layer for VoIP. People talked about it, but there really was nothing there.
Right.
And I think one of the hardest decisions for entrepreneurs is do you take an existing category and you talk about making it better, or do you try to go out there and beat your head against the wall and create a new category. What kind of lessons learned would you share in terms of this idea of building on something that exists versus going out and trying to explain to something that there should be something new that may not exist?
Yeah, I'm not sure when Scott and I were formulating what we were going to do. We really understood we were building a new category. We may not have chosen to do that. We had, we had these nice diagrams that said kind of applications were abstracted from the infrastructure, and I still remember these little, diagrams where we had these little, interfaces to the infrastructure that frankly didn't exist. And, it's kind of hard to actually deliver applications where you have absolutely no way to connect to the infrastructure. We took that vision, and fortunately, through working with lots of the partners in the industry, we were able to kind of create that separation between applications and infrastructure, and formulate interfaces like SIP and others that allow us to basically kind of deliver what we wanted to deliver. But it was kind of scary in the beginning. We really had no way to, in fact, deliver those applications. There was no way to actually interface, and we had to find pretty creative ways to, at least early on, kind of connect to the infrastructure network. Some which were pretty kludgy, but necessary to kind of get things going. But I don't know if we were really thinking that we were creating a new category until probably a little later on. We were probably naive, realizing that we were creating a new category.
So, headquarters in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Is there a story behind why Gaithersburg, Maryland versus Silicon Valley or some other place start a company?
Well, it's a center of mass between the two places that Scott and I grew up in. I'm from Montreal, and Scott's from Louisiana, and we both decided that Montreal was too cold and Louisiana was too hot. Then we decided we looked at some other locations, and we finally settled on somewhere in the middle. I think obviously one of the big thoughts was Silicon Valley, and everybody'd say, got to be in Silicon Valley, and Scott believed that he finally went to Silicon Valley. So, but I think that for our industry, I think we were very fortunate to be kind of East Coast centric. The carrier community is somewhat, I wouldn't say completely, but it's predominantly kind of East Coast centric in terms of headquarters. And I think if we were in Silicon Valley, instead of being 70 or 80% of the time on the road, I would have been 100% of the time on the road visiting customers. So I think it worked out really well for us to be in the middle of the country, in a place where we could reach our main customers pretty effectively. But it was a really good compromise for Scott and I to find Gaithersburg.
So 1998, 1999. Was it hard to get funding at that time?
I think listening to the trials and tribulations of startups now, and Larry describing that before, I have to unfortunately say the answer was really simple. There was a lot of money flowing in '98. There was a lot of both Scott and I were exiting a kind of an successful acquisition, and so at the time the venture community was I truly believe much more venturing. They were in fact investing in teams without a tremendous amount of market validation or product, or really in a formation. And we were funded almost kind of pre-startup. We were really seeded with enough capital to kind of really build the first concepts and the first ideas. It was harder after that, all the times after that. But in '98, cash was somewhat easy to acquire, as long as and it was very much who did you have venture folks that really believed in you, knew you, trusted that the team would figure it out. And so you heard that a lot in '98. Well, we'll trust the team, we'll figure it out. We'll give them enough money, we'll get going. And they'll get market reaction, they'll get feedback, and they'll kind of course correct into where they want to be, and that's what we did. But it was certainly a lot easier back then.
So you got your first round of funding, and tell us how much it was. And then for I think a lot of entrepreneurs, one of the key decisions they're always struggling with is how fast or slow do you go? Do you do the lean startup where you go slowly, slowly, slowly? Do you run like hell and go big or go home, or or you have to throttle in between. How did you decide at the beginning, and then as things progressed, how fast or how fast you wanted to grow or not grow?
Yeah, so I mean, when we started, the seed round was the Series A round was a little under $5 million, and which that sounded like a lot of money for Scott and I, who basically were meeting and working at a Starbucks. So $5 million seems like a lot of money when you have really no costs, except 2 Dell computers and 2 TDMA AT&T phones. Everybody remembers those things, we kind of started to build a team and started to kind of build some infrastructure, started to kind of build the concepts. I think during that early period, it took a while to kind of really figure out what we were going to do. Then I think your question on how fast or how slow. One of the dangerous things in that period leading up to the explosion of the market was that there were just companies were being formed and concepts were being launched, and companies were going public, and companies were being bought and sold at incredible multiples with really nothing, really no IP, no IPR. And I think we had lots of pressure from investors to in 1999 with no product, no customers, and 5 employees to go public. Only took us 14 more years. I'm slow, but or 12 more years. But it was extremely kind of a strange time. I think that generally the way I feel and the way we've managed it is kind of look at the market, look at obviously how much money you have, what's the capital you have. That certainly gates how fast you can go. You got to really look at, in some periods of time, I felt that, there was really, the market was developing, but not kind of speeding through, and we're kind of accelerating. And so there are periods where you kind of say, okay, let's keep the investment, and let's be careful in cash, and let's be, moderate. And then at certain times, you realize that the market acceptance is speeding up, competition is increasing, and you need to go faster. So I think over the period of the company, we've kind of accelerated and deaccelerated a number of times based on those factors. I'm not really sure always that it's super, looking back, it's always easy to kind of say, well, that makes sense. I think it's sometimes just kind of intuitive to feeling that you're, well, if you have no money, you can't go fast. If you have a lot of money, but the market's not going anywhere, you might as well conserve cash and be ready for when the market moves faster. And then you always have to keep track of not only the current competitive, but also the potential competitive threats that are out there that, may be approaching the market from a different perspective. So, given all that, you kind of have to modulate how fast you want to go.
Was there any time that you went really counterintuitive or counter-cyclical to the market, where the market was decelerating and you decided to put your foot on the gas, or vice versa?
Well, probably, I think in 2008, we decided to, into 2008, obviously going into 2008, the financial markets kind of melted down. It was pretty tough. We decided that although we were already pretty constrained financially, we're trying to be very constrained financially, we felt that the market adoption was moving pretty quickly, and that incented us to kind of move quickly, acquire competitors, and really kind of consolidate the market, as that period was the market was ready for some of that, and the market and although the cash constraints limited our abilities, actually our customers were doing quite well after kind of getting reestablished, and financially the market was actually doing fairly well. And so we decided to kind of go counterintuitive a little bit, and couldn't do a lot, but go counterintuitive a little bit, and really push out in that year.
Great. So I want to come back to the acquisitions in a couple of minutes, but in an early stage company, one of the also key challenges is trying to figure out, do you create the future or do you build the past? Like, if you think about most products or services, you can have a lot of new things, but if you don't have table stakes, then you can't sell, and vice versa. If you have everything that's just the same but not different, then you can't compete. So there were some early decisions at BroadSoft that had to be made. How would you characterize one of them, maybe the decision to adopt a protocol like SIP when nobody else was doing it?
Yeah, I mean, that was I have to give that one to my co-founder Scott. I think one of the big decisions when we started, and one of the one of the early uses of our very scarce $4.5 million of initial capital was to buy a stack, a 323 stack, and we had done all the evaluations. Scott's team had done all the evaluations, and had we had written kind of the check, and we were about to buy this thing, and Scott and I met, and we kind of said, we're going to go ahead, and Scott came in and said, stop, we're not going to, I don't think this is the right way to go, and he said, there's this thing that people are talking about called SIP, and I think that's the way to go. And we debated it long and hard, given the fact that in 99 there was really absolutely nothing that spoke SIP. So it's kind of scary to focus the company on a protocol that was pretty young, not really well accepted, and there was nothing to talk to.
And there's no backward compatibility,
and there was no backward compatibility, and everything out there that, all the devices that were in the market and, that we were being asked to work with were predominantly 323, and then there was some scatterings of MGCP or, protocols that we were playing around with. So it was a pretty big risk at the time. And but I think sometimes you need to take the risk. I think I think if I look back, it's always hard to make these decisions. And I think I was thinking about this. Sometimes, and that's one of the hardest things to do is if you can afford the choices, is actually invest in both paths. Kind of go down both paths a little bit. We really couldn't afford that. I mean, not so much financially, couldn't afford it, in terms of manpower, in terms of building two protocol stacks. But I mean, sometimes, I think we as entrepreneurs, we try to make a lot of decisions between A and B, and there's a certain amount of lack of visibility of the future, and the question is, what would it cost you to kind of go down both paths for 3 more months, so you get a little bit, the fuzziness gets a little bit more clear, and you can make a better decision. I think a lot of times, and I'm sure entrepreneurs sitting around board meetings massively debate A versus B, and sometimes, I try to remember that theory and saying, hey, let's go down both paths. But it's hard because, resources are always limited, and you're always trying to optimize A versus B. If we made a mistake, we would have preferred to have done A versus B back then. Luckily, we made the right choice. So, as Scott would say, it's always better to be lucky than smart. And I think we certainly got lucky. Definitely.
So speaking of limited choices, company's 99, everything's booming, looking great, and then the dotcom meltdown happened, and then it cascaded into telecom. Remember living through that. Most companies at the time went out of business, and they were being followed on the web, and somehow BroadSoft made it out to the other end. What do you think that BroadSoft did, or what are the things that you did that helped the company survive not one downturn, but even the second one? Maybe you could describe those experiences.
Yeah, I think we certainly, a couple things is, like a lot of times, we certainly tried to become quite, pull back. I mean, the biggest challenge we had in the first downturn was that there was just really no customers to engage. I mean, we would go out and we'd talk to customers, and they'd say, Mike, it's really interesting, but by the way, we're filing bankruptcy tomorrow, so I'm not really sure we're interested in your product, And that works great. and Scott will tell you, that was not a funny joke. There's a lot of meetings like that. And, you'd come back at the office and you'd say, no coffee today, it's the booze, man. It's a tough day. And there was a lot of that. There was just a lot of, the CLEC marketplace in the U.S. was basically pretty badly damaged, and there was really certainly, the competitive carrier market in the U.S. is we talk about technology and so on. They're the early adopters, and folks like the sponsors tonight, the Cloud Alliance, folks like that are clearly early adopters that are willing to take a gamble. Well, they were all gone. They were all out of money or bankrupt. So it was quite difficult for us to kind of just continue to innovate with no feedback in a vacuum, really. So one of the things we did, we decided to selectively pick some markets internationally, and painfully started to kind of sell into those international markets, both to obviously to generate some revenue, but I think more importantly to keep the team motivated, the developers motivated, to continue to build a product, to continue to kind of get the feedback and to get customer reaction, and really listening to the customer, what works, what doesn't work, and to kind of continue to improve the product. I think the other thing we did is we both Scott and I, from a very strong engineering background, realized that everything else didn't matter. It meant keeping the product team together and keeping enough of the team together. And so we defended pretty harshly with the board to kind of keep enough of the critical mass inside the company to be able to continue to so when the market did come back, we were able to scale and kind of revitalize the product. But it was a pretty tough time to be able to continue operating in that environment.
Were there moments where you just thought, hey, this is just not going to work, we're not going to make it, and you're just staring into the abyss?
Yeah, there was, there's only, as I always tell people, is for some reason I remember funding events and where I was, and this was a lack of a funding event, and in 2001, it's a little later, it was actually a little later in 2000, I can't remember, that was 2001, yeah. We needed to raise some money, and we were in a fairly complicated situation. We had been, if people follow our history, we had been in an acquisition that was really basically stalled out because the public markets died. We had a bunch of investors, venture investors, that were basically kind of disinterested, and we needed to basically fund the company and kind of restart. And it was a very, very complex negotiation between breaking a merger agreement, existing investors and new investors, and I remember a moment for some reason I accepted a invitation to go to a baseball game in Baltimore at the Orioles, and basically for the whole event we were in some box there for the whole game. I basically was in this back stairwell negotiating a term sheet between the three parties, and basically kind of we didn't work. And at that point, I just was going to go back in the suite and say, okay, guys, we're done. We're wrapped up. And that was probably the lowest point. But then figured it out and kind of said, hey, we're not gonna give up at this point. But that was it was a pretty complex time to raise money and fund out of that. Fund out of that period, and it was very difficult to really get clarity on what I think investors didn't know what they were looking for, why they would invest, and so it was one of the most complicated times to actually get especially in our case, get companies refunded and kind of restarted out of that situation.
And then I think there was another time, different circumstances, but 10 years later, post Lehman bust, so another different kind of bust, and why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were. I think it was interesting. It's kind of we were pretty close to. We didn't realize, and this is one of the things that is interesting, is we didn't realize exactly that, and I think nobody realized how tenuous the economy was in 2008. And again, how close it came. I think we were in the midst of raising a fairly large debt instrument to keep us going. Really we were in the last, I guess, growth spurt of lack of profitability, and trying to basically kind of build out the business. And the question before, Scott, you asked, was really kind of optimizing as the market was going, and we felt in a pretty good place. We were trying to take down and really kind of use that cash to kind of get us to profitability and then growth, and take the company out. And we signed a $15 million debt instrument, I think 24 hours before Lehman went bankrupt. And so I always tell people, like, timing matters, because 24 hours later we would not have raised that money. In fact, the folks that had provided a debt instrument never actually did another debt venture investment again. So they get their money back, so they were okay with us. But it was a very tenuous time, and like I said, a day later we would have really run out of cash. We would have, and at that time it would have taken probably 6 months minimum to have raised kind of an alternate set of cash. So it would have been pretty tough.
So you did get the cash, and then the outcome that we know now is that BroadSoft really ended up vanquishing a lot of the competition and being on top. But it wasn't a foregone conclusion in the early days. In fact, I think most of your competitors were better funded. There were some very big players like Lucent and Nortel at the time, which seemed unassailable. Why do you think BroadSofts ultimately prevailed against these better funded startups and these big giants?
Well, I think we were very focused to basically build out our customer base, really working with the most kind of innovative startups and startup carriers in the marketplace. We very aggressively went after kind of building up from kind of the bottom of the customers, kind of, and getting experience, building the product, getting feedback, getting revenue, building the business really from references and kind of building up. And I think some of our competitors and some of the big players like to go out to the biggest customers first, and we really felt that it was obviously very difficult to, as a startup, to kind of gain the confidence of the largest carriers in the world, and we had to kind of earn our seat, kind of earn our rights to get up there, but it also allowed us to basically build up a very large customer base. Continue to bring the business in, bring revenue in, bring cash in, which allowed us to, invest further, and we continuously just kind of outpaced the competition by having more assets, more capabilities in our product, and more feedback, more real-time feedback. So, some of the other folks basically were in these, 3-year field trials with some tier one, and we were actually in production deployment models with lots and lots of carriers around the world. And we also went very hard globally to get feedback. Today we're in 80 countries. We've been in probably plus 50 countries for a long time, and that was another thing we did pretty early on, is kind of went very wide across the globe. To really kind of get as much experience, get as much customer base in, and really start with the most innovative carriers in the markets, and then eventually kind of build up the pedigree to be able to go after the big tier ones.
And so you guys ultimately end up gobbling your competitors. You had a deliberate strategy of buying them all, and I remember back then, and you've related to that, it wasn't universal agreement either among the management team or the board that was the right strategy. Why did you think that was a good idea at the time? And do you think in retrospect it's a good idea to buy out all the competition, direct competitors?
I think it is a tough decision. I think you have to weigh. I mean, I think what I did at the time, and you're absolutely right, it was not very. It wasn't universally agreed to. It's one of those things where sometimes I will just make it my will. But I think the decision for us was that the market was starting to form. There was a lot of noise from a lot of players. We felt that if we could channel all that capabilities together, we could, in fact, really leapfrog in terms of being clearly ahead of everybody. When everybody's private, everybody can be number one. When you're public, you're not. You can see the numbers. You're extremely transparent. So what was really important for us at that time was the market was developing. We knew the competition was weaker, and we felt that by horizontally acquiring, we could basically own a bigger mind share in the business, and that enabled us to compete with the bigger players in a more effective manner, and that people considered us, they're so much bigger, just from a marketing noise, kind of perspective, market presence perspective, was quite beneficial. It was also an ability for us to acquire, some customers that we had not won, and then again was an effective means for us to not see those customers go to another player, but for us to acquire. We're in I think one of the things that maybe is different than most other industry businesses is that, we're in a business where the lifetime value of the customer is very large and very long. We're selling, carriers a number of seats, and that's let's say a 10-year life cycle of this business or longer, and acquiring those customers was pretty important for us, from a long-term kind of lifetime value of a customer. So we felt it was pretty valuable to kind of buy the competition.
Great. So just a couple more questions before we open it up to the audience, maybe more on a personal level. Are there any areas in telecom that you find that are kind of untapped and unexplored that would be interesting for people to start a company on?
Yeah, I think the one area that I think that generally from the service provider side that I find that is lacking is there is kind of just a general area of understanding what their customers are doing, and whether or not you want to call it analytics or kind of understanding from a more CRM perspective. But generally, I think service providers are very good at selling a service, but not really understanding how their customers are using it and what potential upsells there are, where the customers are not really gaining the value of what they have purchased. So, we have a lot of capabilities in our product, and many times when you go out there, the customers don't really realize the power of the product they have in their hands, which doesn't really create that stickiness to the application. So I think generally the ability to kind of close the loop from the customer back into the service provider, understanding how the end user is using it, the overall kind of experience of delivering that service, that seems to be an area that I think the industry can do more work on, and would certainly improve the delivery of any application from a service provider to the business or consumer.
Great. So last question. 14 years is a long time to do a startup. Would you consider doing another one?
I don't know. This is still the startup. I don't know. I'm not. I don't know. It's every day at BroadSoft is a startup day. So I don't know. That's one of the things that is pretty exciting. We're still we're still very focused. We're still learning a lot. We're still the industry is changing very quickly. It never feels very boring, but every day it's always every day is a new challenge. And I think we're all having a lot of fun. So, if one day that changes, then maybe there's another startup in me. But I'll see.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. I'd like to open up to questions now.
Are there questions for Mike? I'm going to I'll bring the microphone around for anyone who has a question. Just raise your hand, if I can see it. Anybody? Wow.
What, really shy crowd?
Mike, Scott,
That's a shy crowd.
Scott, you did a really good job.
I've got more. I just want to give them a chance.
Yeah.
Mike, there's a lot of things you've done really well, and clearly you're very successful. Is there anything you wish you'd done differently, or paths you haven't taken that you wish you could go back in time and maybe explore?
Thank you.
I don't know. As an entrepreneur, you have to be, you have to believe everything you do is right. No, I think at times, I think the only thing that sometimes struggle with is, could we have executed, could you have executed more effectively? I think, fortunately, strategy-wise, I think we're pretty comfortable with the choices we've made. I think you always kind of second guess in terms of could you have executed better. I'd say, back to this, the question Scott asked, which is interesting. I kind of didn't think of that, is that, with the amount of, with the history of the company starting kind of a long time ago, 14 years ago, and going through two ups and downs and lots of other things happening, we certainly were, although we utilized, a lot less capital than other startups in our industry. We certainly burnt a lot more cash because of that stopping and starting, and that always frustrated me in the sense that $10 million went away, and we could have used that more effectively, but didn't have the crystal ball that you were going to hit these interesting financial situations. But that was always a challenge. I think you always hate when you're in our world, not using the cash wisely. I think that's probably the biggest. You always look back at that. Did you make every decision? Was it smooth enough? Could we done it faster, more effectively? Because ultimately, if you got to raise more money, as entrepreneurs know, that costs a lot. It costs dilution. It's expensive. It's distracting. Raising money is not a fun event. It's not really building your company. It's something you got to do. And if you don't use the cash wisely, that's always a bit of a frustration. So that's probably the biggest thing I always think about is did we use the cash wisely through the whole 12 years?
I got another question back here, and then we'll come to you, sir, up front.
Hi, Mike. You guys went public 2 years ago. I'm curious whether and how that's changed at all the way that you run BroadSoft, and do you have any advice for folks in the audience who might be in a position where they could be, thinking about going public soon?
Thank you.
Yeah, clearly, going public, I'd say you really, you have to kind of think about probably 12 to 18 months prior. The company, you need to start changing the company and thinking about a lot of process changes and so on. I think the company, I'd say that we haven't changed the way the company operates. My advice is if you're going to go that path, which I don't discourage, I think you really need to kind of think and well manage the costs and the complexity of compliance. Unfortunately, compliance is expensive, and you'll sit in painfully long compliance meetings, but as I always say to everybody is all those compliance meetings basically keep me out of jail, so I go to compliance meetings every day as long as they keep me out of jail. But there's a tax, and you just need to really manage the tax very carefully and really plan for it. On the flip side, you have a tremendous amount of access to capital and transparency, and the good thing is that it really allows you to have transparency with your customers. Customers feel like you're going to be around longer, so it's a tremendous marketing and capital raising capability. It allows a lot of your entrepreneurs, your employees, to monetize many years of investment and start to kind of perhaps save some money after many years of working hard. There's a lot of good things, but you got to manage the negatives of that process. And then obviously, going public, as a public company, really carefully managing expectations. And I'd have to say that our scorecard as a private company, in terms of projections, were really never all that good. We were probably always a little more overly optimistic and bullish. You really have to become extremely really good at targeting revenue. It's always easier to target costs, but it's always much more complicated to target revenue, and you need to be extremely well at managing those expectations with the street. So, those are the two things, the guidance I'd give folks.
Hey, Mike, Alan Percy with Audio Codes. Thanks. First of all, I want to thank you for spending the time with us on this really, I think, open and honest view of BroadSoft. So, question was, if you had to pick three things from a regulatory standpoint that you would change, if you tomorrow could make those changes, not only from a financial market, but also too from a communications standpoint, what would you change?
Can we pick one?
All right.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd actually go back to the compliance cost. I think one of the things that it's certainly some regulatory changes have taken place. Unfortunately, we don't fall in that camp. To reduce some of the compliance costs of young public companies, it is it's back to the question before. I mean, when I look at spending $1 million on compliance a year, my immediate thing is, boy, that $1 million could go into product innovation and R&D and really good stuff, and I'm sending it to accountants and lawyers, and it doesn't seem like it's really kind of building. It's not really building anything. And so I'm a strong believer that kind of returning to zero governance and compliance is not a good thing. I have to say that I think some of the compliance and governance processes for public companies is a good thing. I think it just needs to be kind of phased in more gradually and not this huge kind of barrier day one to go public. So we're today embarking on things like risk management and so on. And investors want to know that you're thinking about the big risk items that might hit your business. When you're a startup, you're kind of doing that every day. But as you start getting bigger, you want to start kind of thinking about longer range risk management issues. It's a good thing to do. Do you have to do it with 10 lawyers in the room? Probably not. So that would be my thing, is that would be a very welcome change to the entrepreneurial world, is kind of reducing some of that regulatory governance compliance.
Next question.
I'm wondering, starting to run a company from a Starbucks to then mid-course to ultimately running a public company probably draws on some very different skills. And I'm wondering if you ever sat down and doubted your own skill set at any point in time and said, should I be looking at somebody else running the company, you and or your partner?
Probably stupidly no, but no, I think that I think as the company evolved, I think I changed what I focused my energies on. I think one of the most important parts of I think leading, even at this stage, is kind of driving the vision of the company and driving where the direction. I think for a long time, a fair amount of operational stuff I don't, kind of early days I did, and Scott will remember those, where we were all kind of very hands-on. Some things I'm obviously not hands-on, and but always kind of maintain that kind of the ownership of the strategic vision and where we're going. And I think the other thing that transition from being kind of more what we're going to do product-wise, segments, and kind of very more product-centric, to really probably for the last 7-8 years really transitioned to being a lot more just customer-facing and being engaged with customers as much as possible. And I think really getting that feedback every day, engaging with customers, understanding what their challenges are. I think, to be honest, I think we're the skill that now, funny enough, is as a company gets bigger and more distributed. I think personally, I have to spend more time actually communicating and aligning internally. So that's kind of where you have to start stealing some time from one bucket to making sure that the company's aligned and driven to a single vision, and people feel like they're contributing. That's probably where we are, kind of a transition we're just about taking right now, as we're 600 plus employees and distributed in 20 countries. You just got to make sure that very large distributed team is aligned strategically.
Okay, I know that everybody has been very good listeners for some people since Monday night or Tuesday morning, so I'm going to cut the questions off here to make sure that as many people can stick around as possible to hear these 4 startups who have prepared very hard for today. Mike and both Scott, I want to thank you so much for the time that you invested in the last couple of weeks to prepare for tonight, to fly in specially for it. I super, super appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.